I had a really illuminating conversation with a friend earlier today after they sent me a quote from one of my favorite philosophers, Slavoj Žižek. Earlier this morning, I had come across this picture of someone who put a sticker on the back of their truck which read, "Silly liberal, that God you don't believe in stops me from killing you." The quote that my friend sent me goes, "Pseudo-fundamentalists are obsessed with non-believers' sinful lives because the sins reflect their own temptations. Unlike the truly faithful, they envy rather than pity those who satisfy their appetites." So I thought it would be cool to explore this a little bit more in depth, put it into a video, share it with the world. So yeah, let's get into it. I am going to be discussing this topic of like religion, of the logic of kind of religious rhetoric, with regards to psychoanalysis, which kind of gets a bad rap, justifiably so for some reasons, because there's this kind of idea that Freud, especially, was kind of just this crazy guy who did a lot of coke and was really obsessed with sex and penises, which is kind of true. But I also think that psychoanalysis can be really helpful for kind of uncovering the ways in which religious, ideological, political messaging works, and trying to explicate that it's a good thing. And so psychoanalysis is pretty helpful, or psychoanalytic concepts and tools applied to these conversations can be really helpful. And another disclaimer too, I am going to be talking today about this kind of MAGA-style American Christian fundamentalism. So I'm not going to claim to speak for any of those people. I certainly can't claim to know exactly what goes on in their heads, what they really believe or think about anything. But what I can say is that back in middle and high school, I was a pretty zealous, quite conservative Christian teenager. And when I kind of look back at that and I sort of think about the sort of exploration that I'm about to do right now, I certainly was guilty of many of the things I'm about to talk about. So, to the extent that my experience is reflective of, I think, evangelical Christian culture as a whole, I think I have a place to speak here. Let's go into Freud's basic model of the psyche, which is made up of three parts. He believed the human psyche was made of the id, the ego, the superego. The id is kind of what you can call like our animal instincts or lizard brain, right? It's controlled purely by what Freud calls the pleasure principle, or the idea that humans as biological beings basically want to avoid pain and seek pleasure. It's quite simple, right? If I get hungry, I eat food. If I'm tired, I go to sleep. And if I want to reproduce, I reproduce. Now, on the other side, so the ego is kind of like the base, right? And then on top of that, on the very top of the model, you have the superego, which kind of is sort of like the force of moral restraint of social norms and customs, which kind of work against the id, because if all we did was exactly what we wanted to do, then society would kind of fall into chaos. There would be no law, no order. And so the superego kind of imposes these moral restrictions on what we're supposed to do and how we're supposed to do it. And so the ego is this middle ground that has to balance the demands of the superego with the desires of the id. And the ego is kind of what we present externally to the outside world as our identities, kind of how we go about in the world, kind of managing these two forces that work in tension. The way that certain religious folks talk about God could easily fit the function of the superego. So if you grew up in the church, like I did, you went to Sunday school and you learned that God is the ultimate creator and ruler of the world, so God calls all the shots, basically. And you also learned that God is the source of all good. Or you could say that God is synonymous with goodness. God is just good. And human beings are also created by God. And so in the creation story of the Bible, one of the main messages is that human beings were made to be reflections of God's goodness, right? Our job in the world is to exemplify how good and how awesome God is. But if you've also read the creation story, you also know that Adam and Eve eat the fruit that they weren't supposed to, and that means that sin enters the world. And basically what that does for Christian doctrine is that human beings, basically by being sinful, are called totally depraved. And what that means is that every facet of our being somehow is corrupted with sin and evilness. And so while we were created by a good God and we were created for good purposes, because we are so completely corrupted by sin, the doctrine of total depravity has it that human beings are actually incapable, physically, literally incapable of doing anything good or being good or having good thoughts apart from God. So God becomes this external source of all goodness that human beings have to kind of plug into in order to do or be anything good as we were meant to be, because there is no internal goodness of our own, right? Everything's screwed up by sin. And so, if it weren't for the external goodness of God that God gives us, we would be totally this lawless mess of people that just cheat, lie, steal, kill each other, etc. This very basic, broad strokes picture of the human condition according to Christian theology fits Freud's model of the psyche, right? The id is kind of the source of all of our sinful desires that are just kind of this, mess of selfishness. And God, as superego, it gives us the goodness that then the ego has to mediate so that we can do anything good in the world. We can behave ourselves, right? God gives us goodness to counteract the base evilness of our id. So to go back to the quote of the guy with the sticker on the truck, the idea is that the superego, who is God, constrains our evilness and stops this guy from killing silly liberals, right? If it were not for the superego, if it were not for the goodness of God, then this guy would apparently be killing liberals. So that's, that seems all fine and good. But what this model doesn't really explain is why exactly does I'm going to call him Sticker Guy. Why does Sticker Guy choose to display his contempt for liberals, specifically with this framing, right? Why is it, if it weren't for God, I would have killed you by now, right? Why that? Why couldn't they have displayed their contempt in some other way? So one way we can kind of explore this question is to ask the question, well, if it really is the case that it's just God and it's belief in God that stops people from doing evil things, why don't all the non-believers and atheists of the world go about killing each other? Clearly, there are many, dare I say, most non-believers, atheists, are perfectly decent people. They don't go about murdering folks. They aren't, these evil, depraved beings. So one potential theological answer, which is a whole other can of worms I'm not going to go into, is that, well, actually, God gives atheists a conscience even if they don't realize it. But that's another thing. But I think psychoanalytically, you can say that the reason why liberals don't going about killing each other is because they are also under the constraints of superego. Superego doesn't have to be God. You don't have to name the superego as God. You don't have to believe in an external being that really literally exists out there in order to not do evil things, or in order not to feel the weight of moral constraint, of law, of order. So what this shows, I think, is that the superego doesn't have to be attributed to a single being, and rather that the superego, can also be thought of as the collective constraints of society, of law, right? So another way you could think about it is, well, liberals who don't believe in God don't go about killing each other because, they believe in common decency, they have relationships, there's the law to consider, there's social repercussions for, bad things that people do. And so you can't say that there is someone out there really pulling the strings that becomes the force of superego in someone's life. And so it seems like the superego is actually an internal force. There are some people who actually just don't care about external law, and they do go about doing awful, terrible things. In classical psychoanalysis, before we came to diagnose things a little bit differently, a psychotic person was exactly this kind of person who just didn't care about the impositions of superego. Right? It seemed as though they just did not care that there were certain things they're not supposed to do, and they do them anyway. So you think of psychopaths, for example, who some of the world's most heinous serial killers and rapists, Ted Bundy or whatever. Well, maybe Ted Bundy's a poor example because he repented later in prison, but superego is part of the psyche. It's part of the individual person psyche. It's not necessarily an external force, or you can attribute it to an external force, but it doesn't have to be one. And so what Sticker Guy is doing is basically naming the superego as God. God is the one that holds them back from committing evil. God is the one kind of reining in this guy's evil desires. So where does Zizek's quote, come into all of this? Well, after Freud, there was this French guy called Jacques Lacan, who was a psychoanalyst as well. And he developed the concept or the idea of jouissance. And jouissance is the French word, I believe, for orgasm, but it's also translated as enjoyment. So what is jouissance? Well, jouissance is deriving excessive pleasure from something even when it hurts or harms you. So what makes jouissance different from regular pleasure, the pleasure that the id is driven by, is that the subject, the person, knows that the thing that they're doing is harmful or forbidden in some way by the superego. So to use an example, cigarette smoking is a kind of jouissance, because the superego, in this case, manifests in all the PSAs that tell people how harmful smoking is for your health. The pictures on some cigarette packs of awful cancers and tumors. The person who smokes a cigarette ostensibly knows that cigarettes are bad for them, because they receive all this messaging, and that's the superego at work, right? That's the external, the law, the rules telling you how you're supposed to live and whatever. But it's specifically the knowledge of the harm of cigarette smoking is actually what makes it more fun. So if you transgress the superego, if you go against the directives of the laws and rules and moral impositions, you actually derive more pleasure out of the thing that you know is hurting you. And so to put it simply, jouissance is the extra fun you get from doing something you know that you're not supposed to do. So to go to the Sticker Guy, as much as Sticker Guy doesn't kill silly liberals because God won't let him, I think the fact that he chose to message his contempt for liberals in the form of this sticker specifically shows that he is at least dwelling a little bit in how much he wants to kill liberals, right? He really feels like, I wish I could, shut them up, or these stupid snowflakes are doing whatever. And so there is clearly a recognition. This guy recognizes he has these violent desires, and he's kind of dwelling on them, and he gets some kind of satisfaction or pleasure from the possibility, or from thinking about, contemplating killing liberals. And so he dwells on this desire just enough to put it on the truck, but he's not so driven by it that he actually goes and kills people. And so if we remember now that the superego it's an internal interaction, it's not actually an external being out there who makes you do things or makes you not do things, then we can also say that Sticker Guy is a perfect example of how we also derive jouissance, enjoyment, from our own internal repression. It's by explicitly denying your own pleasure gives you jouissance. He knows he's not supposed to kill people. God said killing people is bad. And it's because he really likes thinking about how much he wants to and knows how much he can't, that he gets this extra pleasure of jouissance. And so envy, the way that Zizek talks about it in his quote, is also a kind of a jouissance. It's a negative emotion, it's self-destructive, but you still get a kind of a sick kind of pleasure from feeling envious. And I think that the MAGA style American Christian nationalism is marked by a lot of envy. Um, and the evidence I have for this is that I've been to several churches where, of course, this wasn't necessarily the main focus of the sermon, but there was a lot of messaging about just how evil the outside world is. The world is corrupt and fallen and sinful and harmful. Um, you know, there was a lot. It goes with lots of implicit or explicit transphobic messaging, or homophobic messaging in general. That and so you get this sense when you go into these services that, like, wow, we the congregation, we the church are sort of this protected enclave of God's will on this earth. This kind of source of goodness, a light in a dark world, is a phrase that you hear a lot in these kinds of places. Um, and so the outside world is evil and wrong, and it creates an us versus them dynamic, right? But what makes this us versus them dynamic really interesting, when you think about it from a psychoanalytic perspective, is that by framing the outside world as sinful and then really hammering in on it during the sermon, what function is that messaging serving? Of course, I think there's a basic kind of messaging that's about fear and trembling before God. We're wretched, evil sinners, and we have to be saved. Like, that's okay. Instilling a fear of God. That's one function. But another function is that by really focusing on this, the churchgoers are encouraged to derive enjoyment, jouissance, by thinking about how bad everyone else is. Um, and so it's not just a look at how good we are and how evil they are. I mean, that is what it is. But the deeper process going on here is that you can get off on sin by not participating in it. You can get off, you can get pleasure, you can get jouissance from considering how evil other people are by imagining just how reckless and evil and lawless the outside world is. Like, oh, outside of these church walls, the world is just this wretched place. And it is only because these churchgoers assume that the outside world must be as evil as this messaging is telling them, that they can enjoy sin by not sinning. Because in order to derive the self-satisfied, sort of self-justified attitude that some Christians are known to have, you need to have an external world that is allegedly fallen and sinful and evil. This kind of ideology feeds on the very thing that it's claiming to hate, claiming to want to destroy, claiming that Christ is going to put an end to all of this. Um, you know, in order for churchgoers to feel like they have it together because they believe in God and other people don't, these other non-believers, these sinful people, they have to exist. In order for me to feel special as a believer, there have to be other non-believers doing all the evil, sinning things that I'm not allowed to do. So what's the point? Well, the point is, or at least for me, I don't like this. I don't like. Basically, I don't like when God is named as superego. So I describe myself as a Christian, but I don't like the idea that a religious structure needs to enjoy the sin of others. I don't like how some evangelical churches really just can't seem to get over the fact that the world is fallen and whatever and evil, because it is, right. I mean, I think the positive side of kind of Christian theology is that the world needs healing. The world is broken, and it's an awful place sometimes, but God, Christ does the work of the healing. Christ does the job of fixing things, and that there is a way out of the mess, right? There is hope. There is a light at the end of the tunnel, and I like that messaging. I think that's a very positive thing to have hope for, but I don't. But I don't want to feed on the sin of others in order to feel self-justified, in order to posture about how good they are, or in the case of Sticker Guy, I don't like when Christians get really obsessed about how evil people would be if not for God. If not for this divine principle, the super egoic kind of command that stops me from being evil, because it takes away from the fact that evil, sin, hopelessness, brokenness is a problem that already has a solution, right? And in fact, dwelling on it and feeding off of it and deriving a kind of a self-satisfied pleasure from it, I think is a backwards thing to do, and I think it's something that Christ, if literally Jesus existed, I don't think he would have wanted us to be thinking like that. I don't think that that's the kind of behavior that he would have encouraged, and I don't like the political messaging that comes out of this sort of ideology, because it invariably becomes xenophobic, fascist. You've heard all the buzzwords. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Hope you enjoyed. Maybe you learned something. Hope I did a decent job of explaining the thoughts that have been kind of swimming in my head all day.